Hello, everyone. Happy Arbor Day and welcome to our sixth session of our webinar conference. Our conference, this is being hosted by Rice Creek Field Station and the Canal Forest Restoration Project housed at SUNY Oswego. I'm Kristen Haynes. I'm the Assistant Director of Rice Creek Field Station, and I'm a project member of the Canal Forest Restoration Project. So here with me to talk about how to grow trees from seeds is Steve Frost. Steve is a teacher's assistant in the South Seneca School District, and he's been growing and distributing trees for years. So today we're going to be sharing our tips for growing trees from seeds, and I'll let Steve add anything that he would like to this introduction.
Okay, well, as Kristen already told you, I'm a certified elementary teacher, happily working as a teaching assistant, because who's going to hire a 68-year-old third grade teacher? So I'm happy with that. And over the years, as I got better at my craft, my hobby, the South Seneca School District just adopted me and my mission. And now every year, you know, I get support from students and other teachers, and it's an outlet for me to give away trees. Last year, the school posted an announcement of the annual South Seneca Oak Tree giveaway on our website and on our Twitter account and on our Facebook page. And before all was said and done, last year I gave away somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 baby oak trees. And that's how I ran into you good people. Is a friend of mine at school told me that he picked up 2 of your baby white oak trees last year, and I should get in touch with you, and the rest is history. You came to my house, and it was kind of humbling. You know, I was in the presence of some real serious educators, and you know, I'm happy to be part of the team. So that's me. So, and the people at school think I'm just a little bit nuts. I'm going to, oh, I forgot to hit the share screen. And here's a picture of me at school. I'm adorned with my Got Acorns cup. Somebody at school, you know, they all think I'm nuts, and somebody at school got this for me, and I take it with me everywhere. So anyway, that's me at school.
Well, thanks,
all right,
Steve.
what else you got?
I will say that it was also a humbling experience for me, and I think our project team, to just give a little nod to Steve's work, because we're kind of just starting up in this whole thing, and to kind of meet someone who has been successfully producing so many trees on his own for years and doing this distribution was really neat. And we're so glad to have Steve's support and have been able to work with him on kind of a shared goal. So let's see. So I'm going to start. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so a little bit about my background in kind of growing plants in general from seed. So I'm a plant ecologist. I spent over 6 years studying rare plants and growing them from seeds for experiments. So this was both in the lab and also in places like on top of mountains. Currently, as part of the Canal Forest Restoration Project at SUNY Oswego's Rice Creek Field Station, I'm helping raise native oak and pine trees for free distribution to the public. And if you're interested in hearing more about that project, our previous webinar kind of covered that, so you can go check that out on YouTube. So I kind of got started in this line of work. I want to say at an early age. So this is me with my dad. And, when I was young, I was sort of always kind of planting seeds and seedlings and branches and trying to like quote save trees, like this one in the pot. It was a little seedling that came up in our yard, and hoping that they would grow. And unfortunately, a lot of these weren't successful. Maybe some of you can relate that, you think it's going to be as simple as sticking a seed in the ground or repotting a little tree seedling and they die. So I think maybe in part it was this guilt over having so many failures, but this curiosity to really learn more about plants, how to foster them, learn more about their ways, that prompted me to study rare plants in their conservation in graduate school. So I learned how to collect seeds. I learned how to turn them into plants. But the thing is, you don't need a graduate education to do this. This is something that everybody can do with very little cost. And I think that's really what motivated Steve and I to offer this webinar, just to share some basic kind of starting points for people who are interested in doing this. So first of all, so we're all on the same page, what is a seed? So this is kind of a simple model of a seed. It's basically a baby plant that has a protective coating, and it usually has a food source. So this is a pretty brilliant design because you basically have a little baby that is being sent off in the world and can survive some really harsh environmental conditions. And this is a key to plant success across the globe. So they're very hardy typically as their seeds, but as soon as they germinate, they're very vulnerable. And this is like the most dangerous life stage for most plants. They really only get this one chance to grow, take root, establish. And if they mistime things and conditions change, then they're basically toast. Like it's kind of like a one-shot deal. And they can't move like animals can either. So as you can imagine, seeds are very careful about when they sprout, and they are very good at therefore reading certain cues in their environment that tell them when to sprout. Like they would not want to be sprouting in winter in that other picture. So there are a number of different requirements or cues that can trigger seeds to sprout or germinate. So basically all seeds need constant moisture. And in the left-hand picture, I'm watering some. They basically need 100% humidity in order to germinate and survive their first few days. Many seeds need light in order to sprout. And then some need very specialized conditions, like they might have to experience fire, or they might have to have physical abrasion, or they might have to pass through the stomach of an animal in order to germinate. Now in our region, water and light are common. Fire is less common. But one very common need is to experience a period of cold that is, basically our winter in the Northeast. Germinating in the spring makes sense for a lot of species because this is when, light and moisture are abundant, and, trees or other plants have this long growing season ahead of them in which to establish themselves before having to deal with another winter. So if you have a seed that isn't sprouting, it could be for a few reasons. It could be viable, meaning good, it's a good seed, but it could just be dormant, meaning that one or more of these requirements wasn't met. But as soon as it's met, it will sprout. The other option is that it's not viable, meaning it's a bad seed, and no matter what you do, it won't sprout. And there's some reasons why it could be non-viable. It could be old. Some seeds last longer than others. The seed could be underdeveloped when it was released. or it may have been partially eaten by an insect or rodent, something like that. So for these reasons, growing trees from seed isn't really as simple as just picking up any old seed, sticking it in the ground, and expecting that it's going to grow immediately. So how do we grow trees from seeds? So just kind of a general overview here. The first step is you have to collect the seeds, and it's best to collect seeds when the trees are naturally dispersing them, meaning when the trees are naturally releasing their seeds. That's the best time to collect them because, as we discussed, old seeds sometimes lose their viability, meaning as time goes on, they're less and less likely to still be good. So I call this step observe and find because it really requires you to pay attention to nature and kind of invoke your inner squirrel. You have to, instead of what most of us do when we're walking down the street looking at our smartphone, it really requires you to start opening your eyes, paying attention to when, your trees are the seeds are ripening, when they're being released. Remember that if you're collecting seeds from private property or nature preserves, that you should obtain permission first before collecting. So many seeds don't need any processing really, and you can just kind of collect them as they are. But I stuck this in for anyone interested in coniferous species because it can be a little confusing for people to know, like, where are the seeds? How do we find them? So this is showing a cross-section of a cone, and basically within each scale of the cone, you'll usually have 2 seeds. Now, by the time cones fall to the ground and their scales are open, a lot of times they've already dispersed a lot of their seeds. But unless you're willing to go climb up into the tallest branches of trees, we don't really have another option other than collecting them off the ground. And usually there are still some seeds inside. So you just want to dry the cone out a little bit, then tap it on a surface and it'll release the seeds. You can pull back the scales a little bit if you need to. And that's what a couple of our students are doing in this image. Okay, so then you can perform a float test. So before your seeds dry out too much, it's a good idea to put them in water and see, which ones float and which ones sink. So typically a good or viable seed will sink and the bad ones will float. And this could take a few hours. It could even take overnight for this process to happen. You should remove the wings from seeds like maples. Now, this test doesn't work for all species. It depends on sort of the density of the seed. So if you have a whole bunch of seeds that are floating and you think they're probably viable, what you can do is, take one of the seeds, cut it open, and if kind of the inside of the seed is, very firm, it's full, it doesn't show any signs of like decay or insect damage or anything, then odds are, your seed lot is good and just that particular species, the float test maybe doesn't work for them. So next up, you want to plant your seeds. There's 2 general camps here. We actually use both of these general techniques to grow seeds for the Canal Forest restoration project. So the first is to use Mother Nature to your advantage and directly plant your seeds outdoors. Seeds have been sprouting for millions of years in nature, of course. So if you're growing a native tree species and you plant your seed directly outdoors, then it should ensure that all of their environmental conditions that they need for germinating are met. So it kind of saves you some hassle this way. So advantages of this method are that it's easy. It avoids certain risks like mold or premature sprouting that you get in the other technique that we'll talk about. Cons are that you kind of need some yard space. If you want to transplant afterward, it could be more difficult than if you start inside. And you could have animals that find and eat your seeds. So that is definitely a disadvantage. Okay, so the second method is basically you have to mimic Mother Nature if you want to start your seeds indoors. So pros of this include you can start your seeds earlier. You are not going to have to worry about animals eating your seeds, and you don't need as much space, but you might have problems with mold or premature sprouting. It also requires a little more investment in materials, so the costs might go up a little bit. Okay, so if you want to do the first method, these are some kind of general guidelines. You want to find a site that has adequate sun and space to grow. It's a good idea to loosen up your soil well to a decent depth to allow, the roots to grow without being constrained. Plant your seeds and cover them with a thin layer of soil that you sort of gently pat. Um, and we recommend that if you're doing this, especially if you're doing it and you're going to overwinter these seeds, you might want to protect them with wire mesh because this could help deter some of your squirrels, your mice from eating all your seeds. When you see them sprout, you want to water them for the first few weeks after sprouting because again, that is a vulnerable life stage. After that point, keep your eye on them, but they'll be more hardy at that point when their roots are more established. And if you are needing to transplant your seeds in this process, like in the picture at the right, they're planted at such a density that you're going to have to transplant them eventually. You want to do so when the plants are young. It's going to get harder and harder, and you're going to have less success the longer you wait. So try to do it early. Try to get the whole root if you can without damaging it. And do note that, it's possible you won't have all of your seeds germinate the first spring. Some might germinate the second spring if, they're whatever, the winter was mild and it takes another season to break their dormancy. Okay, so if you're starting your seeds indoors, this is a little more involved. Let me get my notes in line. So you'll basically need to mimic winter for your seeds. And you want to start with like a soil substrate. Peat moss works really well because it can deter some of like the molds from growing. It's antimicrobial. So you want to take your peat moss, mix with water until it's just moist, meaning if you kind of grab a bunch of it in your hand and squeeze, you start seeing little droplets of water on the outside of your hand, but you definitely don't want it to be waterlogged. So you're going to add some peat moss to a plastic bag. Then you're going to add your seeds, make sure they're in contact with the peat moss. Seal up the bag, and then you might want to put that bag, if it's clear, you might want to put it in like a black plastic trash bag or in another opaque container because, as we said, certain seeds, light will kind of activate them. It'll induce them to germinate. So that might be something you want to add to this. You place those in the refrigerator for 2 to 3 months for most of our native species. It does vary by species. Some don't need this at all. Some need 1 month, some need 3 months, but usually about 60 days is a good ballpark if you have no idea what your tree needs. You want to check these bags periodically that are in the refrigerator to make sure they're not drying out or prematurely sprouting. So to germinate, you're going to take your mixture that's in the bags and spread that over pots or a potting tray filled with soil. Either add what's called a humidity dome, or you could just take a clear plastic bag and kind of tent this over them. That's going to maintain that 100% humidity that the seeds need to germinate. And it'll also keep them a little bit warmer. And most seeds like to germinate around like 68 to 72 will be optimal for germination. Now, as soon as they sprout, you want to remove like your bag or your dome because there's this fungal disease called damping off that can affect young plants if their conditions are really moist. So as soon as they germinate, remove that and just water them very well. That might be twice a day, it might be once a day. Just make sure they're moist for the first few weeks. And then you can transplant to larger pots or even outside. And I will note that pot depth is very important for not stunting your tree's growth. It actually turns out to be much more important than the width of your pot, the depth of your pot.
Mm-hmm.
So our last stage here is to make sure you're protecting your tree from, things that might want to eat it. So from herbivores, we already discussed sort of maybe using wire mesh over seeds to prevent herbivores from eating your seeds. And this would be squirrels, mice, moles,
Chipmunks.
deer. What's that, Steve?
Chipmunks.
Chipmunks, yes.
My nemesis.
Once your tree has germinated, there's even things that will either try to eat the nut once it's germinated for a little bit, or start eating, the foliage or buds off your young tree. So we recommend using either wire mesh, or you can get these long plastic tree tubes to help protect your tree. And especially if you live in a place with deer, this is very critical. If you want to protect from winter injury, especially if you have potted material, you want to make sure that that's either the pots are buried in the ground for winter, or they're like mulched really well. Because if the soil inside the pot freezes, the tree will actually die of thirst because it can't suck up frozen water. So those are kind of the basic steps. Find your seeds, do a float test if you want, plant them, protect them, and then repeat. And this is true even and especially if you fail. So this took me, yeah, Steve's putting his hand up. So this took me a long time to learn and a lot of guilt to learn, but failure is normal, and it's okay. And we all should just remember that for any large, huge, mature tree we see, usually only like 1% or fewer of their seeds actually succeed and become another mature tree. So usually they replace themselves, and only like one of the thousands of millions of seeds that they release ever makes it to being a huge mature tree again. So, most of us, if we have a little bit of success, but we have some failure, we can feel good about the fact that we're still doing a pretty good job. So yeah, even if you fail, like this is what science is. I think we all, if we're in this business or hobby of growing trees, it's normal to have this happen. So I don't want it to deter anyone from sticking with it, trying different things, trying to find help online if you need, and eventually you will have success. So I just want to add some resources here. There's a lot of free online resources, like the USDA's very extensive woody plant seed manual that includes tons of information about typical nursery practices and seed handling for a whole bunch of trees and other woody plants in our region. And then there's like some shorter resources like the Global Trees Campaign Basic Primer for starting trees from seeds. There's also some web pages and some apps that can help you too, and apps that, for instance, can help you identify trees that you find, and so you know what kind of species you're growing. So with that, I will turn this over to Steve. Okay.
Okay, we are back.
We are back after a little pause. So I am going to turn it over to Steve.
Okay. I got involved in this hobby for slightly different reasons than the Rice Creek Field Station did. They were trying to white oakitize all the area that the Erie Canal harvested all those oaks years ago. All right, and the reason I got into growing oaks was just because of the mast crop. Okay, a fully mature white oak could, on a good year, drop 10,000 acorns. right away, the squirrels go to work and they bury all those acorns because it becomes part of the Squirrel National Bank. And all winter long, that squirrel or another squirrel might dig up this or that acorn. And at the end of the winter, those that weren't dug up and those that didn't freeze have an opportunity to germinate and become, you know, a full-grown oak tree. You might get one tree out of maybe 10,000 acorns. That's a guess. I don't know. Over the years, it's going to play out. My attempt was to mimic Mother Nature as close as I could, knowing that a squirrel is going to bury this acorn and, you know, maybe it's going to live and maybe it won't. And by tweaking the microenvironment that I store my acorns in, I up the odds that it's going to survive and turn into a seedling. So what I would like to share is just a few of the tricks that I've learned that help me get more successful in growing baby oaks. And if I can find my PowerPoint. There we go. Now, except
yeah.
I did not hit the share screen button first. So that should be me.
Yep, perfect.
Do you have me full screen?
Not yet.
Okay, what am I doing wrong?
You'll just go to slideshow.
Oh, slideshow. Yep, got you now.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so you've already seen me at school. All right, one of the first things that I discovered that helped my success was that I grow my own dirt. And this is where South Seneca, my school district, stepped up. Every day, all the people in the cafeteria save the compost, all the leftover mashed potatoes, and you know, everything else out of the salad bar that they can't serve tomorrow, they put in a bucket for me. And I'm bringing home average between 75 and 100 pounds of fresh compost a week, times 30 weeks during the school year. That works out to be between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds of stuff going into my compost pile. Okay, but wait, it gets better. All right, moving on. For a while, what I'm doing is digging holes in my compost, bury it. And the raccoons would say, hey, it's Taco Tuesday. There should be bean dip at Steve's tonight. So they were digging up my compost and eating it. So I made some changes to the way I did things. Again, talking about failures and changing things up. Okay, oh, here's a picture of one of my students. This is a video, actually, and I call this bio slime. All right, here we go. Watch this. All right, 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of that stuff a year that turns into compost that I use as medium for my trees. Now, moving on. At the end of the season, I have harvested all my dirt, all my compost, and then I start rebuilding it for next year. So what we're looking at here is what's left of my compost pile and a whole bunch of apples that I added to start the whole process again for this coming summer. And then in August or so, I collect 5-gallon buckets, and I'll talk about buckets in just a minute. And later I will talk about this rack that you see. I've got screening hardware cloth, 1/2-inch square, and this is a video. It's got some audio with it as well. I hope you can hear it all. It's only about 20 seconds long.
So here we have hardware cloth frame positioned over empty buckets before, and then I'll come back and show you an after. We're going to filter, sift all of this compost out and get rid of stuff that's still hard and solid.
Okay, so what filtering or sifting does is it gets rid of all the stuff that's not yet fully decomposed, and the medium, the compost is fine particulate matter, which is just ideal for the root growth on a baby seedling. And the reason I go with, I can't show you tall enough, the reason I go with deep buckets is to allow that oak taproot. Oaks grow a taproot that goes straight down. And if there's no sticks and no stones in the way, it just allows it to go deeper and faster.
The takeaway is that we now have 2, 4, 6, 8 3.5 gallon buckets of finely sifted compost. Perfect nutrition for baby trees.
Okay, now let's talk buckets. And Kristen, you mentioned this earlier, the depth of the bucket is pretty important. We want a deep bucket to allow for the taproot to go very, very deep. And again, rodent defense is paramount. I started using these tidy cap buckets and 5-gallon buckets years ago. I have replaced those with, let me go back one. All right, these white buckets I get from Wegmans Market's bakery department. At the end, these were icing buckets, and when they're done, they go into recycling. So I just show up every Saturday morning and collect how many ever they have available for me, and they have made my process a little simpler as well. I'll move on to that in just a second. Okay, next. So either the tidy cap buckets or the icing buckets, which are working very nicely for me. And now, this is a store. This is the name of a company that I bought my nut wizard from. This is a long-handled acorn harvester. It's got a little cage on it, on an axle. And what I do is I roll that over the ground, and the acorns pop inside the cage, and I could fill this cage in 15 or 20 seconds if I found a hot spot. I can easily fill a 5-gallon bucket in 30 minutes if I've got a hot treat. So if you're interested in harvesting lots of acorns, I would advise you to buy a nut wizard. Handy, handy tool. Okay, now, just like Kristen said, you want to get your seeds in the ground in a timely fashion. Last year, there were very, very few, next to no white oak acorns out there, and Mother Nature played a dirty trick on us in May. So when I bring home seed, I put them under this rack that keeps the squirrels and the chipmunks out, but allows me to store them until I'm ready to plant. Now these nuts at the top are actually shagbark hickory. I went out and picked up a bunch of those because I couldn't get any white oak acorns this year. But as soon as I get them home, I try and get them into the buckets right away. The sooner I get them planted, the better. I've got spreadsheets that tell me the bucket number, what kind of acorn it is, where that source came from, and how many, and the date that I planted it. And I just keep track of that as I go through the season. And then when I'm ready, after I float them, I put them in a bucket, somewhere between 50 and 100, depending on the size of the acorn. English oaks are a little bit smaller acorns, so I can put more of those. These are whites. So I've got that bucket filled with compost almost to the top, put in the acorns, that last inch of compost on top. Then I put lids on them and thoroughly water. In fact, I'll water them 2 or 3 times. And I drill holes, 2 or 3 holes, about a 1/4-inch hole, just a little tiny hole, to let the water drain out. I don't want standing water. You can drown your acorns. But thoroughly moisten the soil, put the lids on them. And that's why I'm liking the Wegmans icing buckets better, is because they stack, the lids are tight, and makes it so that I don't have to water them all winter long, every couple weeks. This way I just put the lids on them, stack them, and forget them until springtime.
And does that also keep the rodents at bay, Steve?
Oh, absolutely. So this is last year's crop, all lined up, ready to go in storage. Okay, so each of these has somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 acorns, plus or minus a few, stacked and ready to go. Now, you mentioned, snow and the environment that they're going into. Freezing is bad, cold is good. All right, so what I needed to do was find a place where I could store these where they're not going to freeze, but they're still going to be cold. And what I found is my house has an addition on it. It's the den. And under the den, there is this storage space that's about this much too short to be standing up tall. So I have to walk bent over, but I stack all my buckets up against this back wall, which is the foundation wall that backs up to my basement. So I'm getting a little bit of heat loss through that wall, which is keeping this area from freezing. So it's just cold enough to make the acorns happy. So I've got happy dirt, I've got happy buckets and happy temperature. And when springtime happens, I start to look like this. Again, rodent defense. I bring my buckets out when I start to notice that the trees are starting to break through the surface. I unlid them all, take them out, and I put cages on. I've got 9-inch cube wire cages that I staple and then zip tie the corners to keep the rodents out. And once I've got them caged up, I move them out into my nursery. And this is just off of my backyard. And I've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 or so acorns planted in this little spot. And I just watch them grow all summer long. Okay, these were English oak, up about 2 or 3 days. And then late June, early July, my yard starts to look like this. Each of these buckets looks like a little tiny chia pet, or a big honking chia pet, I should say. And each of these buckets could have 35 or 50 little baby oak trees in there. And then by late summer, this is bucket 31, and these are whites. These are swamp whites. They're 16 inches tall in one growing season. And this just astounds me. And I've got roots all the way to the bottom of these buckets. Okay. And then moving on, there's a close-up so you can see the 16-inch. And there was my best tree last year that was 21 inches tall. That's a bur oak. And these are all cousins of the white. And now here's a video that shows how I harvest them out of the bucket. This is one of my students.
Yeah, I think you're stuck in the middle somewhere. It'll click. There you go.
Hey, Steve, I don't know that the video was feeding through super well. Can you describe what was going on?
Okay. Notice I'm using black that I protected my eggs with. I placed that over the top of the track tire. I'm back. I'm back.
You're back. We lost you for a second.
Yeah. I got a couple notifications that my connection was unstable, but anyway, I'm back. So with my hose on jet, I let me go back there. Share screen. Go. Share. Want to go to the next one. All right, this is the fourth side of it. Well, this, and then we done. And then I use the hose to rinse off all of this compost so that when I separate the root hairs, I'm getting very little damage. If you go to a nursery and buy a bare root seedling, they're just going to pull it up out of the ground. And a lot of the tiny, tiny root hairs are damaged. This way I get, I'll bet you 98, 99% of the roots fully intact and happy. So the seedlings are better. Now, if there was one weak spot in my process, it's that this bucket is only good for one growing season. So I have to plan on harvesting them either in the fall, and that's why I have the South Seneca oak tree giveaway in the fall, so that I don't have to worry about them. I don't have to store them through the winter so that the roots don't freeze. You spoke of that earlier. Or if I had the storage space, I could keep them over winter and then do this same process again, rinse out the dirt and give them away in the springtime. But the bucket is only good for one growing season. And that's the only weak link in my, my part of this, this game, I think. What else do I have? Okay, if someone were looking for white oaks out in the woods, there's a difference between reds and whites, which are the two primary oaks in this area. White oaks have rounded lobes, whereas red oaks have pointy lobes. And these are the ones that we're looking for. And this is part of a poster I printed and put up at school. Again, I described the white oak leaves compared to the red oaks, and go on to say that most of the white oaks in this part of the country were harvested during the construction of the Erie Canal. And all those barges that traveled from Albany to Buffalo were built out of white oak lumber as well, further decimating the white oak population. And, Dr. Haynes and Dr. Pauk and myself, we're just trying to put white oaks back into this corridor across central New York State, upper New York State. We want to give away a bunch of baby oak trees. We want to grow more baby oak trees, and you can help. If you know the location of any white oak trees, you can let me know. Right here at the bottom is my email address at school, and I would love to get my hands on as many acorns as I possibly can this coming fall. If you get in touch with me, we will make arrangements to get those acorns in my hand. Maybe you can mail them to me. Maybe I can meet you halfway. We'll work that out later. Or if you want any baby trees, by all means, get in touch with us. We want to give away trees and get them planted out there in New York State. So, and that's the same thing again. Oh, slow down. Close. Let me try again. And I want to go here. The shared window is closed. Can you see me?
I can see you, Steve. Yep.
Okay. I got this funky screen. I don't know why.
Okay. Did you just start your sharing again?
Current slide, yes.
Okay, great.
So I'm now from current slide. There we are. So this is a quick review on my part of the show. One, we want a deep bucket. We want holes for drainage drilled into them. And we want our soil or compost. We don't want any rocks or sticks in it. And you want to collect your acorns and float them. Any floaters, you just want to discard those because an acorn weevil larva ate up all the inside first. You want to plant them about 1 inch deep, and you want to store them through the winter, cold but not frozen, and you have to keep them moist. You want to bring them outside in springtime when the freeze danger is past. Year-round rodent defense, either lids or hardware cloth. Keep them watered all summer, and you have to plan on harvesting and planting either in the fall or in the spring because the bucket is going to be too crowded next year. And that's what I learned over 15 or 20 years of playing with oak trees. And people do think I'm nuts. Except Dr. Haynes. You guys love me. And it's just so heartwarming to be involved in a project. So that's me. So I'm going to stop sharing. And that takes us back here.
Okay, fantastic. And I'm glad you mentioned a couple things, Steve. One that you noted, like the hardware cloth for rodents, and doing a little research. From what I found, you really need like a 1/4 inch size roughly if you really want to not have any mice or chipmunks.
A mouse can get through a hole, you know, not much bigger than a 1/4 inch.
Right. I mean, they say that something around the size of a pencil a mouse can get through. So
yeah.
So the mesh size is critical. And I just want to reiterate this because I think the video feed things might have been a little choppy, but that you use kind of like the jet function of your hose, ring around the bucket, and then you're able to get the plants out and hose the soil off, right?
Exactly correct. The bucket just dumps out after you jet the hose around the inside, dump it out, and then use the jet and something a little less violent as well to get rid of all that dirt. And it takes a little bit. It takes a little bit of spraying. And then I repurpose the dirt again. I just reintroduce it back into my compost pile. So last fall, when you and George came to my house and I gave you a bunch of buckets, you know, I will dearly miss that compost. But that's okay. I'm growing more.
Yeah, well, it's a lovely sustainable process. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, the fact that a lot of this can be obtained from recycled containers, compost that you can make yourself, seeds you collect yourself, means that you don't have to make a huge monetary investment to end up with lots of trees.
This was all free. This was all free. And anybody who's watching and wants to try this, you don't have to do 40 or 50 buckets like I do. You could get one bucket and you could go out and buy, you know, a big bag of just garden soil at your big home store, home centers. You know, just put some hardware cloth over the top of it. Keep it cold, not frozen. I can't say that enough. And keep it moist, keep it rodent proofed. And in the springtime, bring it out. You could have 30, 40 oak trees that you can plant on your own property or give away to friends and neighbors. But again, it's a short window that you got to get them out and planted in the fall or restore until spring and start over.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to pop over to one of our questions that someone submitted. And if you have another question, we have a couple more minutes. So just put your question in on the YouTube chat and we'll see what we have time for. But we have one person who asks, what is the shelf life of a dormant / viable seed? Is there a point where it can become unviable?
I don't really know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. That would have to come from a biologist with more more stuff on the brain than I've got.
So for this question, it really varies. So some seeds don't really keep their viability beyond a single season. So they don't form what we would call a persistent seed bank. It's kind of like they succeed or they don't. So the shelf life of those would be pretty short. Pretty quickly after they're dispersed, they won't be viable anymore. Some can form, you know, they can remain viable for a long time. And then a very extreme example would be some of these like olive tree seeds that you can find perfectly preserved in like caves in the Middle East, and they'll still germinate. So that's a very extreme example in the other direction. So a lot of it depends on your storage conditions, and it also depends on the species. So I would recommend, you know, probably you're either going to need to look it up for your particular species. For a lot of them, you can assume that they're going to be most viable for like the first year, and then it might start tapering off after that. But, you know, under proper conditions, I believe I've read that a lot of our native conifer species, you can store the seeds dry and cold for like 10 years. So
Mhm.
there is quite a big variation. Okay, we have another question. So what do you think about distribution this summer with the pandemic problem?
Um, I don't usually distribute my trees until um, September, October, back to school. So I hope we're back in school by September, but I haven't been outside much. I've been out in my nursery, but not out and about in public. I do my best to stay away from everybody.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge for sure. And hopefully, like Steve said, by fall, things might be better. And that's actually a really great time to plant trees.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of
Just
people think
before
that
they go
spring is
dormant.
the time, but fall is a really good time too.
Mhm.
In the meantime, we are considering things like, you know, drop offs at the side of, at the end of our driveway at the field station, or these kind of things, ways that we could maybe get trees into the hands of people who want them without coming in close contact with them. So
That's what I do at school, is I just set up out in front of the school right on Main Street. And I just, how many you want? 10, 20?
yeah,
So
so we'll figure out ways. And if
yeah.
you get in touch with Steve, or if you get in touch with us at the project, canalforestrc@gmail.com, we'll find a way to make sure the trees get into your hands.
If you want a tree, we'll get one in your hands.
Yeah. Okay, so we have another question. What is the temperature range for storage? This person is wondering if their detached garage would be too cold.
Yeah, I used my garage for several years and had pretty good results. I've got one wall, the narrow side of a rectangle is again, the basement wall. So I'm sure I'm getting some heat loss there, but not as warm as the storage space under my den. I would say anything over 32 degrees is okay. Even 30,
Yeah.
And so I suspect that your garage, even though it's a separate structure, certainly it's worth a try. Certainly worth a try.
Yeah, it's worth a try. And I guess the temperature range you're kind of shooting for, like Steve said, is around like 32 to lower 40s, I would
Lower
say.
40s would work.
So, you know, a good place might be like refrigerators are perfect. For some people, maybe their basement might be good, or if you have like a section or a closed off porch of your house, that might work well. Um, yeah, so you could experiment with the garage and see.
Or maybe in an unheated attic upstairs in your house could be a possible as well.
Hmm.
Just cold, not froze.
Yes.
And that's a pretty broad range,
Yes. All right, well, that's probably all the questions we have time for today. We are so happy for everybody who joined us, and we hope that this inspires you to get started growing on your own. I want to give a huge thanks to Steve, not only for his support of our project, but for joining us today to share his knowledge. He has a really great growing method that I think could be a very inspiring place to start for a lot of people. So thank you, Steve.
I was so happy to be here.
Well, our pleasure. And on behalf of our Canal Forest Restoration Project, we want to wish everybody a very happy Arbor Day. And if you're interested, join us right in 5 minutes at 4 o'clock, and we will have another webinar coming up for you.